Hi, I'm Warren Howard.
And I'm Mark Parry.
And welcome to Crazy Compass, the podcast for business owners, leaders, and managers navigating the messy reality of leadership, especially during times of uncertainty, disruption, pressure, and change. Because if you've led people for any length of time, you know leadership doesn't always feel clear and controlled. Sometimes the compass just starts spinning.
And that's really what this podcast is about, helping leaders reorientate themselves faster, think more clearly, and lead with intent when things feel uncertain.
And between us, we've led businesses, built teams, managed through growth, setbacks, restructures, and crises. Mark, we've seen it all, and coached hundreds of leaders through similar challenges. And importantly, what we want to do is help translate those experiences into something useful for you as a leader.
So whether you're leading a business, a team, or simply trying to find clarity in a complex situation, you're in the right place.
So let's get into this episode of Crazy Compass.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. I think in terms of starting this episode, it would be useful and good to have a quick summary of the takeaways from our first episode. And what we said was losing direction is normal, even for strong leaders, hence our term Crazy Compass. Intentional leadership creates clarity when things feel uncertain. Crisis is sometimes easier than ambiguity, and therefore leaders create direction. Step back, focus on the critical few, then move forward. And also we spoke about you've likely got the answers, and the key is reorientating quickly.
I think that is absolutely right, Mark. And if you think about where we are right now and what's happened since we had that first podcast, gosh, there's been some change, there's been some disruption, there's been uncertainty, everything's been thrown at us. We've had the war in Iran, we've had the issues around the flow of fuel and the fuel levies and the changes to that. We've had two budgets, a state budget here in Victoria and a federal budget coming through. You could be forgiven to think that compass just doesn't stop spinning. It's out of control.
Yeah, look, it's a good visualization, and all those things that you spoke about are external to what leaders have to face within their business, but there are clearly consequences to those things. They can create uncertainty within the business itself, and not all of the federal budget things have landed yet. And as we know, capital gains tax issues for small business owners, etc., are troubling. Certainly, there's enough commentary around that young people are feeling uncertain and concerned about the future. And if you've got those people working in your business, that's how they feel. And it really does create that total sense of uncertainty for leaders. And ultimately, you've got to make sense of that, provide some clarity for your team, but then think about how to move forward. So stop the compass spinning and try and get a direction.
To reorient it, as you said earlier. Yeah, actually reminded me of an example, Mark, one of my coaching clients who I had a discussion with in the last week, and it was a backup conversation to one we'd had earlier, and I think it sort of typifies what we're talking about here. This person had really felt that everything had changed in their particular environment. It was an operational environment, which usually has worked to fairly fixed plans and deliverables, but a lot had changed in this person's world and was impacting on their ability to deliver. So I think the word to sum up how that person was feeling was overwhelmed. Okay. Things that had been controllable in the past, but were no longer predictable. So we had a good conversation, that initial session. The follow-up one I thought was really illustrative of just a good example of how to deal with uncertainty and change. Because when we spoke the second time, what they said to me was, I said, how are things going? They said, actually really good. And I thought, okay, this is a good start. I said, why is that? And they said, well, I feel like I've made some ground, regained traction, and I've simplified the situation. And this was a really important lesson because previously we talked about the fact of, you can only control the things that are within your sphere of influence, right? Things are going on around you. You have to be cognizant of them and be aware of them and work out the impact. But you can only control what's in front of you in your control. And he did that. And I said, how did you work your way through that? And he said, well, I just reminded myself of something that I've used in the past. And that was to just take one step at a time. And on reflection, he was saying, I have a tendency to perhaps overthink things and try and think too far ahead, too far down the track, in which case I sort of get into that paralysis state and thinking, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to get there? He said, I've decided to just let the journey be the guide in this case and to take one step at a time. And with each step, reflect on what I've learned and move forward. And he said, by taking one step forward, my team is coming with me. I thought it was a lovely story, going from overwhelm to now getting traction and feeling somewhat in control of your immediate circumstances and using that, one step at a time analogy. What do you think of that?
I think that's a good one. I think the other part of that is sometimes it's hard to get out of that malaise and take that first step. And if, with your permission, if we can open the door to our audience on a conversation you and I had, which was along similar lines with your business.
Sure thing. Well, you're going to tell them anyway, aren't you?
Well, I will ask permission, right? So, rather than ask
Agreed.
no problem. It's no secret that many small businesses, including Howard Co, are going through some difficult times in terms of where the economy's at, where our clients are at, and where your business is at. And you and I had a conversation where you were looking at the revenue, looking at the fixed cost lines, looking at margin, looking at work we had in hand and what the future of the year looked like. And I think it's fair to say there was a lot of uncertainty. I think it's fair to say that your compass was spinning and you were probably unsure what the next step should be. Now, at the heart of that, when we started to unpick it, was factors that cause what we call emotional resistance. You care about yourself, you care about your business, you care about your family, you care about your clients, and you care about the people who work for you. And the malaise or the spinning compass was really about, you probably had a reasonable idea of what some of the next steps might be, but that emotional resistance, which comes from care at the heart of it, and we could open that up a little bit more, stops the mind from thinking clearly. And one of the things that we did in that conversation, we said, we don't have to agree or do anything, but let's free think it. And we started to work through what some of the potential actions were. And you started to map out what those conversations might start to look like, firstly with Elizabeth, given this is, your family business, and then with the people that work for you. So we created clarity. You determined which way the compass was going to point. And then the emotional resistance came about. I'm clear on what I want to do. I'm clear that I'm going to have a conversation with my team, but now I'm concerned about how those conversations will go because I'm concerned about them and their needs and how they'll receive it. So when we coin this phrase emotional resistance, it can often come from the fact that we are attached to our business, to our clients, to our people. And if and when we decide on an action, which might have a change for any one of those parts, we then go through all of this resistance about how are they going to receive that and how do I deal with that? Now, ultimately, you did that well. The team responded exceptionally well. And there are some contingencies put in place now to address the market in which we've got. So there's another example of a spinning compass, some inertia, not knowing what to do, knowing what to do, but then going through all that emotional resistance because of that care and concern.
Thanks, Mark. I think I asked you at the time, can you care too much? Can that be itself a point of resistance? And I don't think you can care too much, but what I think you can get is a point of imbalance where you're sort of losing that overall perspective of, if you need to make some important business decisions and those business decisions are going to obviously impact on people, but you need to care about the outcome as well as caring about the individuals and the people as well in that process. And so for me, it was just getting that back into balance, saying, yes, I do care. That's an innate value that I have to care about my team, my people, my business, myself, but to make sure that I keep that in balance so that the decisions I'm making enable me to move forward. And what was helpful was just having the conversation, Mark, if I can be honest, just being able to articulate and express some of those thoughts and feelings I was having during that period when really we'd come off a very, very busy end of 2025 calendar year. And the first 2 months of this year were markedly different. We saw a marked drop-off in business. And I know now, talking to other business owners, they experienced exactly the same thing, like we'd come into a different world. And for me, the challenge was, is this a trend or is it just a short-term disruption? And sometimes no one's going to give you the answer to that. I don't know because we're here today. Ask me again in 2 months' time. But importantly, as leaders, we have to make a balanced assessment of what we see in front of us and then decide how we act. And I think that balance, I keep coming back to that because it's meaningful for me, that balance can sometimes also come from talking to somebody else, getting a different perspective, and then enabling you to weigh up what you should do, could do, and can do, but then do it, right? Because that's the key, as you're saying. It's one thing to think about it and talk about it, but then as leaders, we do need to actually make a decision and then act on it. Because otherwise we get stuck in that inertia. And that not only impacts us, but also impacts the people who work for us.
Yeah. And as we said earlier, just using the federal budget as example, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. People are not clear about the future. They worry about their jobs. They worry about what they can afford to live, a house, etc. But that, particularly in a business context, that means that you need to be clear and making a decision, which later may prove not to be the totally right decision, and you might need to change direction a bit, and there's nothing wrong with that, starts to provide clarity. Part of what we discussed during that time, Warren, as you said, about care and can you care too much? Now, care doesn't mean ignoring or accepting poor performance, but we spoke about care in terms of three things: care for self, care for business, and care for others. And at times they can all cross over each other. So then we spoke about, well, firstly, you've got to compartmentalize those caring feelings and thoughts. And again, using the example that we've opened the door on here with our conversation, the first thing I said is, what do you and Elizabeth want out of the business? Are you going to continue it in its current form? And start to think about self and then business before we get to the others. We're not going to ignore them, but we're going to deal with the level of thinking around self and business before we get to the other part. And I think that created sort of the freedom and the headspace to say, I'm not going to not care, but I'm going to put that to the side for a minute, compartmentalise, if you will, that particular issue and deal with what's in front of me.
It's really good. That's important and helpful to reflect on that, Mark. So let's think about people who are listening to our podcast today, owners of businesses, leaders of businesses. Some of the things you can look for to recognise whether you might be in that place of inertia and where emotional resistance is behind your inability to move forward. I'm thinking things like, you might identify with this, just avoiding making that difficult decision, putting things off, substituting more work on your part for actually stopping and thinking about, is this the right thing to be doing? Or should I be doing this? Delaying some of those performance conversations that you should be having, but just hope that perhaps they'll rectify themselves. Just continuing to carry too much personally. And by that, I mean not sharing it, right? Not having the courage, the willingness to be able to admit, I actually know what to do at this point. Or just help me get through this. Can I talk it through with you? No judgment. I just need another perspective. Perhaps that care can go too far when we worry about hurting other people. Of course, we don't want to hurt people, but sometimes you can be hurting them more by not bringing them into the picture or sharing with them some of what you're thinking or planning. And I think the other one would be this one. And I think, I know personally I fall into this one. It's wanting certainty before acting, right? Needing to get things right, 99% okay, before I actually reveal and say, hey guys, I've got the answer. Let's go forward. I think what's important out of that is that we recognize when those things start to affect our behavior, then it's probably that emotional resistance that's causing it. And let's check how we can actually better manage that so that we can move forward. How can we actually address it, acknowledge it, move on?
Yeah. When I listen to that, I think about that emotional resistance. And then when you start to work through all the checklists, as you just said, you're actually going through some emotional upheaval. One way or the other.
Yeah.
One of the things I used to say in a business that I worked in, do you want to be in the pack of lemmings that gets to the edge of the cliff and has got nowhere to go but forward? Or do you want to stop before you get to the edge and turn left or right? Either decision is much better than going straight off the cliff. Either decision may not turn out to be the right one, but you can always alter direction after. I think also inherent in what you said, particularly for small business owners, when you're going through emotional resistance, emotional upheaval, and you're not certain, you tend to think you have to do more yourself. This is reliant on me. These people are reliant on me. If it's not going right, it's on me. And ultimately, that is the wrong thing to do at the wrong time, because people can see you withdraw. They can see you look tense. You may not have time to have the conversations that you should be having. You're doing the heavy lifting themselves. They can feel disempowered or disengaged. And you're not getting the benefit of the parts of the business working towards a common goal, albeit that the direction you've chosen may be leading you forward from where you are, but not necessarily on the right path towards the end, which can ultimately be changed at some point in time.
And so it can be almost counterproductive because you allow that to then, your behavior then becomes taking more on yourself. And in which case that distances you from your team. It may be shielding them from reality. And what the effect of that on your team, let's reflect on that, is that when people don't know but have a sense that things are changing or something's going on, if they don't have information, what happens? They start to imagine.
Yep.
Speculate, make up the stories, and possibly start acting in a way that's not going to help you at all. So you're creating a bigger divide. And so it's really important to think about, it's not just how we feel ourselves as leaders about the way we're dealing with these situations we find ourselves in during uncertainty, but also the impact, whether it's direct and intentional or indirect and unintentional, the impact that that has on the people who work for us. Because our brains work in curious ways, right? That they need to understand things and interpret. We need to understand, interpret things. And when in the absence of information, we make it up. And quite often we make up the worst case scenario.
Yeah, look, that reminds me, and I don't know if anybody's seen it, but there was something that I did on one of the management or leadership programs where we all watched exactly the same section of a movie. So think about that in terms of business circumstances. Everybody's watching the same movie at the same time.
Yep.
But what they did in one, they overlaid some romantic, nice music, and they worked all the way up to horror music. So exactly the same piece of footage. The emotional reaction to each is fundamentally different. So in the absence of information, people are watching the movie. The soundtrack going through their head might be the horror movie. The soundtrack going through yours might be dramatic, melodramatic, concern, or whatever else. But you have to provide the soundtrack to give people clarity, right? And by engaging them and explaining to them what's happening, being honest, look, things are uncertain at the moment. Yes, our revenue is down. Yes, these are the concerns. We're going to review some of our fixed costs. You engage them and you remove the horror scenario or the horror music that they may be imagining because they don't have clarity and certainty.
So they're making up their own soundtrack in that sense. So if I join the dots here, Mark, you've mentioned quite a few times the importance of clarity, but we probably should distinguish clarity from certainty here, because the pursuit of certainty is the thing that often stops us from communicating. Not quite sure yet, I'll just wait until things are right. But clarity doesn't necessarily mean certainty. Clarity can mean, well, let's acknowledge the circumstances we find ourselves in right now, the things we know, the things we don't know. Right? Let's be clear about the direction we're moving in. Has everything changed, or has just something changed? But let's be clear about where we're heading. And then be clear about what are the next steps, or in my coaching clients' case, what's the first step we're going to take to guide us on the journey? And then what role do we all and each of us play in that next step? We can be clear about those things without necessarily guaranteeing the outcome, particularly if we say the outcome will be as a result of what we now do. We have to be prepared to learn from that. But here's the direction we want to go in. Is that sort of fair? Certainty, you don't have to be certain, but you can be clear.
Do something, this is what we're going to do right now. I mean, I used to row surf boats when I was younger, and we used to have a sweep who used to say, if we're going to panic, let's get organised and we'll all panic together.
Yeah.
I've also heard people say, if I make a decision or we just say we can do something and it's not certain, which it won't be, and it doesn't happen as we expected, I'll look weaker because I've made a mistake. That was wonderfully reframed for me once by somebody who said, well, why don't you just run an experiment? And when you think about an experiment, you do certain things and you expect an outcome. If that outcome doesn't happen in your experiment, you take your notes, you take your learnings, and you decide what you're going to do from there. So I think you're right. If leaders believe that they need to create certainty or wait for certainty, then they're bound to be in trouble. Now, the horror music will be playing for people. You'll have people leaving, a whole range of things. If you can say, at the moment we need to do X because of Y, and I think we're going to get this. And by the way, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to review where we're at. And if that's not quite right, we'll think of what else we're going to do post that. Then at least there is some clarity about the direction and playing a different soundtrack in people's mind to the video that they had before. And I think that's the role of leader. Now, harking back to what we said before, that all sounds simple when we're sitting here doing a podcast. It all sounds simple after you've been through it with somebody. That emotional resistance, which creates emotional upheaval, is real. But so too are the consequences of not doing something. If you think about care for self, care for business, care for others, you have to either be able to make decisions, engage with your team by yourself, look in the mirror and do it, talk to your partner and do it, talk to somebody like us to do it. But the speed to react, particularly in an upturn and a downturn, become vitally important. Because if you're the lemming at the edge of the cliff, you've got nowhere else to go.
Yeah, so true. You're out of options. I'll come back to your point about the experiment, Mark. I think that addresses actually something that I hadn't considered, but that is risk. I think one of the factors why sometimes we don't make decisions quickly is because of risk, right? We're looking at, well, if I do that, and it goes wrong, what will happen? We think, we're placing too high a stakes on our way forward. The notion of an experiment, why I like that, is experiments are just that, right? They're small steps taken intentionally for the purpose of learning, all right? What's a simple example, right? You run a bath. I don't think people have baths much these days, but let's say we do. Right, you've got young children. That's more typical. You're running a bath for one of your children. You heat the bath up. You don't put the child in before you test the water.
No.
Right? You don't do that. You test the water and you think, that might be a bit hotter because you can put a little bit more cold in there or vice versa, okay? The point is we can learn by small experiments, and to get that, the temperature right, it makes sure those steps are taken intentionally for the purpose of learning.
I think that's good, Warren. Yeah, in this, we've been using examples of business performance or almost, whole of business risk. Emotional resistance can come from many ways, and it's sometimes during our career. We've gone through emotional resistance and emotional upheaval because we know that a person is not performing. And we get the wrong side of care. We think we have to care for them by either carrying them, not giving them the truth, or whatever else. Now, the ripples in the pond when that happens echo across the organisation because others say, well, hang on, Warren's not performing and nobody's doing anything about that. You have to, in that instance, put aside the care for that individual, at least in your mind, focus on the care for others. We want everybody to be part of the team and contributing, and then the care for the business. Then you deal with the performance issues, and it could be retraining, it could be a skill issue, it could be a competence issue, it could be an attitude issue. Now, you don't turn off care when you do that, because in dealing with that person, let's say ultimately you're going to move them on to another job in another place, you have to do that in a way that maintains their dignity.
Yep.
Allows you to live with the emotional turmoil of making that decision. And more importantly, and most importantly, the organisation sees that you dealt with poor performance, but you dealt with it in a way that still cared for the individual. So therefore, they in themselves will care.
Yeah.
And many times where we talk to people, it's because they're not holding their team or a person to account. The outcomes and the actions to us are self-evident because we don't have the same level of care because we don't know that person. We're not going through the emotional resistance. But by taking them through that and compartmentalising those issues into care for self, care for business, care for others, pretty quickly they come to the determination they have to do something, and then we're invariably involved in how they do that legally and appropriately and with the right care. So that's also something we've sort of spent a bit of time on in the last several months with different clients.
We have, and it helps, I think, get very specific about what we mean by care, because care does have those different dimensions, but making sure that the balance is right, that you're not overweighting one for the other. I think one of the areas that tends to get forgotten is that care for self. And if I can just sort of expand on that one a bit, Mark, because recently I've been having conversations with a number of businesses about the impact of change particularly around AI and other things that are changing the type of work that they're doing and how they're going about it, is the need or the prospect of having to restructure their businesses, which might then lead to redundancies of roles because those roles no longer fit the new structure. When you run a business, and particularly a small business, those decisions become very personal.
Yeah.
And these are people whom you've employed, probably made friends with over time, and you're now having to embark on some very difficult conversations, and you probably lose sleep over it, right? And it's that, you tend to lose the awareness of the impact of that on yourself as well, because you're taking this very personally also. So that care for self is just as important during these times when you are thinking about others and the impact on them. You think about, well, how do I actually maintain and preserve the energy that I need to have to be able to present myself at my best when I'm having those difficult conversations, so that I'm not rushing them, that I'm feeling, positive in the sense that I have prepared well and that I'm in the right headspace to be able to listen and to care for the other person as well. But I need to, that old saying about, fit your oxygen mask first before you go to help others. I think that really applies when you're having those difficult conversations. Make sure you're in the right headspace and have prepared yourself well to be able to do that, so that you can be able to listen, attend and respond. And then, as you said before, Mark, address the interpersonal needs around respect and dignity and being able to preserve the relationship even though you're going through something very difficult as well. So think about how you want to be in that moment.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Warren. So let's focus on care for self, which, again, when you're doing a podcast, seems self-evident. When you're in the middle of all the shit, you've got emotional resistance, you've got emotional upheaval, you're not sleeping well, it's up to me to run the business. That becomes overwhelming. I, through my working life, probably from 10 years in, learned this, that the way I cared for self was ensuring that I had my exercise regime rigorously. Before I got married and had children, I could do that post-work. Even as my jobs got more senior and end of work time was a bit more flexible than it is early on, I could do that. As soon as we had kids, I realised that I couldn't do that religiously. So I started to switch to doing it pre-work in the morning. Family was asleep, so I wasn't impacting on their time. I was going to get to work on time. If my work day went a little over, I was still going to get time with my family. But more importantly, that exercise let me clear my head, keep my energy levels high, and whatever else. I've also spoken to you before, in one of my first sort of senior roles, I worked on a site. It was probably about 3 kilometres around the boundary. And it was the first time I had a secretary, and I remember feeling a bit overwhelmed one day, and I said to this lady called Christine, I'm going to walk the boundary. And I just walked round the fence line and cleared my head and that became our code that I need some time to self. Because, when we do things like this, and we talk about body language, tone, words, people are taking cues from your tone and body language. And if you're overwhelmed in these times of uncertainty, and that can be the business is growing or the business is restructuring or the business is shrinking, people will pick up on that, and you won't have the energy to create the gap, to compartmentalize and put the conversations in a way that cares for you, cares for the business and cares for others. So we think that balance is vitally important.
Totally agree. Something you and I share, Mark. I focus on fitness and health. We both like to swim. We compare our times. You're always faster than me. That just gives me something to chase. But for me, going to the gym, like I have a regular 2 visits to the gym a week. I have a routine that I go through. And what I find is, and I'm sure people can relate to this, sometimes at the end of the day, I just do not feel like going. I think, I'm just too tired. I won't, no, I'll skip it. But what I do then is think, no, hang on. I know how good I feel afterwards. And also, it allows me to switch off. And it's amazing how many, even though I'm not consciously doing it, how many issues and problems I tend to sort through and potentially solve while I'm working on one of those machines. Because I'm just letting my mind go to work. I'm not consciously thinking about it, but I've got a new environment, a different perspective. I guess I'm getting some blood flowing as well, right? Because we spend a lot of time sitting on the screen. So taking care of yourself, we've really, really focused on that right now because I think we're talking to leaders, right? This is a leadership podcast, right? But we want to make that link, don't we? Because what we're saying is the antidote, the cure for emotional resistance is that bias for action. Yeah. And while we may not have all the answers and why the compass might still be spinning, It's the action that we take that will help steady the course and actually enable us to move forward. So can we summarize and say, well, what are some of the things that people can do to help them move forward when they get stuck?
Well, clearly creating time for self and exercising is one of those. You can mentally reframe, and an example I've used before, I was going through some emotional resistance in dealing with some individuals that were exhibiting poor safety behaviour and putting themselves at risk. And particularly when you're younger, those sorts of confrontations, and that's the way I was visualising in my head, create resistance. The reframe that the DuPont manager told me was, it's best to have the conversation now than be forced to be standing next to someone's widow whilst they're burying their partner because you didn't deal with their at-risk behaviour. Now, that's a very strong and poignant example, but quite often there is a reframe. I was talking to somebody yesterday. They're going through some restructure based on growth, so it's a good news story, but they currently have a position who's a round peg in a round hole.
Yep.
And the job that will be created as they expand is probably a square peg. And I said, so your role is to reinforce to that person how good a job they're doing and the fact that you rely on them to do that job and they do it very well. Then you create the emotional freedom in your mind and the organisation's acceptance that you're going to create this new role around something that's fundamentally different. So making time for self, certainly exercise is a way to clear their head, reframing, compartmentalising, and then trying to work through, am I really not taking action because I'm scared or I don't know? But reflecting on that means that the organisation is feeling the same as you feel. And as a leader, you will not be doing a service to self, business or others by not moving forward.
That ties back very nicely to what we've been talking about, the importance of communication throughout this. That while uncertainty might be causing you not to communicate, it's better to communicate with clarity than to have all the answers. And to do that frequently, bring people on the journey with you by sharing information, knowledge, questions, by acknowledging and also admitting that we don't have all the answers right now. But let's deal with what we know, what we do well, and what changes we need to make to actually address what's in front of us. It's all about bringing your people along with the journey so that you don't feel yourself disconnected, which can sometimes happen. It's what we've observed. So let's summarise.
Well, I think if we summarise and we go back all the way to the first episode, Crazy Compass, leaders at times can feel that they've lost direction. The crux of this episode, particularly given the economic uncertainty and all the external factors, is that that's creating a circumstance and environment where we've got greater uncertainty about the financial health of our business, where our revenue might be coming from. That can start to, particularly for small business owners, start to play out as, I'm responsible for this. It's up to me to do things. It creates emotional resistance when we start to think about some of the things we might have to do would have people implications. You know, you might have a shorter working hour week, you might need to have less people and whatever else. The only way out of that is to work through using a framework of care for self, business and others, compartmentalise the issues, work through what you can influence and what you can manage, have a bias for action, as you said, Warren, and then go out and communicate, provide clarity to your team about the way forward. And if it's so uncertain, then tell them you're going to run an experiment. Tell them for the next 2 months you're going to do something, and we'll review where we're at each week. And if we haven't quite got it right, we can change. You don't have to do that alone. We won't hide from the fact that this podcast is about leadership. We're happy giving you some things that you can use. But companies like us are here to help. And we love to help because we've got some very good experience. But you owe it to yourself, you owe it to your business, and you owe it to others to work through this. And the other thing that we've been discussing, which you didn't discuss a lot today, but we know for certain based on our past, black swan events like Middle East, like the GFC, like COVID, like unforeseen budget circumstances happen. Good businesses, good leaders, good people endure, and they get to the other side.
Thanks for the summary. Mark, if I can add maybe 2 challenge questions for anyone who's listening. Number one, what's the one thing you're resisting most that you now need to address? And secondly, what's one small action you can take to create momentum? All right, MP, this again has been a very, for me, enjoyable discussion. I hope others have enjoyed it as much. We try and stick to the script, but I know we always deviate and create a few new stories along the way. But that's just how we roll. But I'm hopeful that the messages have been clear for those who are listening that emotional resistance is natural, right? We all care, we all feel for our business and for our people. But as leaders, we need to lean into action, and we can do that in a very considered and careful way, even though and even when we're not absolutely certain about what the outcome will be. So we would like to invite anyone who's listening to share with us any challenges or questions that they might have that we could address in future podcasts. We'd love to hear your stories. And in fact, in future, we may even have some interviews with people who are listening to this podcast as well. But if you've got a leadership challenge or question you'd like us to discuss, send it in. Use the link on the podcast. And we'd love to hear some of the real situations that leaders like yourselves are navigating so that we can inform and educate others from our own experience. So, Mark?
And we'd also like them to share, Warren. There's a whole lot of people out there that we don't know and don't know us. And if people think that, they've got a contact who would benefit from listening to the podcast and or providing some content or questions for us, we'd love for that to happen.
Indeed. And we've mentioned the coaching work that we do. Hopefully through this podcast, you'll get a sense of how we like to work together and with our clients, because we know that, it's lonely at the top. And sometimes leaders just need space to think clearly. That's a role we can play. So if you need a sounding board or someone to help you reorient, we are here. Get in touch. We'd love to have an initial conversation with you. So, Mark, I'm going to hand over to you, mate, to close us off for podcast number 2.
Well, thank you, Warren. And I think we've covered everything we wanted, but I'm hoping that this podcast in particular, given what's happening externally, resonates with people. And the other thing that goes through my mind, based on our work experience and the people that we work with, we're yet to come across a problem that can't be solved in one way or another. And that's why we're here, and that's why we hope that this podcast and any future help that you ask for is helpful to you.
Well said. See you next time, mate.
Thanks, buddy.
Cheers.